Greetings in the name of our soon coming King Jesus Christ, and welcome to this episode. Today I am with our friend Vivienne Myburgh from ICEJ. Vivienne, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you, Marko.
Great. Today our subject matter is this amazing prophecies in Ezekiel 36 and 37. In Ezekiel 36 and 37, we are told about a very long series of amazing, mind-boggling prophecies. What are these prophecies, Vivienne?
They're amazing, really, because, Ezekiel, so many thousands of years ago, is speaking about the days in which we find ourselves today. And I love the fact that he actually starts off in Ezekiel chapter 36, addressing the mountains of Israel, which is effectively the heartland of Israel. The mountains of Israel includes the places like Hebron, the place where Abraham and Sarah are buried, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah are buried in Hebron. It includes Shiloh, which is, of course, where the first tabernacle was erected and where Samuel was the first judge of Israel. So this is the very biblical heartland of Israel, and this is why we see the attack on these areas, the tension around these areas. And, of course, today the world is calling these areas the West Bank, because after 1948, Jordan took these areas over in a war of aggression, and it became known as the West Bank of Jordan. But it is such an incorrect name because it is actually the areas of Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of Israel. And I love the fact that it doesn't matter what the enemy is saying. And just now we'll read about what the enemy says about this area. God has got his plan for this area. It's his covenanted land that he promised to give to his people right from the beginning. And of course, even in verse 2 already, it does say, the enemy said, aha, the ancient heights have become our possession. The fact that they even recognize that it was not their possession in the beginning, but they have had this agenda to take this for their possession so that they can literally call the God of Israel a liar.
But now, I want to backtrack a little bit, Vivienne. In 1948, Jewish people came back.
Already from the late 1800s, they were coming back. God was calling them back.
And they became a nation in 1948. No.
That's right.
Now, what is the significance or what is the connection with the Jewish people becoming an independent nation in their homeland and Ezekiel 36? Is there a connection between the two?
There is 100% a connection between the two, because you will read in Ezekiel as well, quite a few times God is saying to them, I have scattered you amongst the nations and I am going to bring you back into this land, plant you in this land. And then he says a very interesting thing. He says, and you will be my people and I will be your God. In other words, literally the name of God, his character, his faithfulness, even for you and for me, is proven by his ability and absolutely his intention and his fulfillment of bringing them back from the nations after all these thousands of years.
Nearly 2,000 years.
2,000 years, and planting them back in the land.
Now, Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel prophesied that they will come back and become a nation. Yeah. And then he also further on prophesied how they are going to grow and become a prosperous nation. Actually, not just a tiny, weeny little nation here, but a really big muscle in global politics. Yeah. Has it also been fulfilling in front of our eyes since 1948? Can you see any connection there as well?
Okay, so this is amazing. But before I go to even the prosperousness of Israel, which he speaks about in verse 11, if I can go back to verse 8, where he already there says to them that your mountains of Israel will produce branches and fruit for my people, for they will soon come home. And you were just referring to the fact that they started coming back in the late 1800s. That fig tree, because the fig tree has always been the personification of Israel, started becoming tender and putting forth its branches, ready to receive their people home. And it's such a clear connection to Matthew 24, which Jesus spoke about. And he said to his disciples, and this is why it's so exciting, of what we're seeing happening today in the big prophetic picture of where we are. Because when his disciples came to him, they said, how will we know the sign of your coming? How will we know the end of the days? And he took them back to the fig tree, which is always Israel. And he said to them, when the fig tree becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, this is in Matthew 24, then you know that the summer is near. And when you see these things, you will also know that I am near, even at the door. And then he says a very interesting thing. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. And so when did this fig tree start budding and blossoming? Kind of from the turn of the century, but it really started fully blossoming and then starting to bear fruit in 1948. And
so
this is
from
when
1948 until now, how many years has it been?
it has now been 75 years. Israel will be celebrating her 75th birthday next year in May. And so he is effectively saying the generation that witnessed this happening in 1948 will by no means pass away until the end of all things. And so we're already 75 years into this generation. And so the question is, how long can that generation be? I don't think it's much more than 80 years or 90 at the most, but we certainly are in the last days. And it is just this beautiful picture of this fig tree. And then to come back to your second point, he's saying they're going to be bearing fruit. And he speaks about this as well a little bit later in verse 11. He says, I will look upon you with favor. I will cause many people to live on you. The towns will be inhabited, the ruins will be rebuilt, and I will increase the number of people and animals living on you. And you will be fruitful and become numerous. And you will be more prosperous than what you were before. Then you
this
will
is for the
know,
Jewish people.
Yes, then you will know that I am the Lord. And certainly Israel is more prosperous than what they've ever been before. This tiny little nation that is the size of the Kruger National Park, like our national park, is literally the world's 8th biggest economy today on the planet.
And military-wise?
They are the 8th strongest. And they are just growing all the time. The economy is strong. The IDF is strong. And just out of interest, if you want to look at the amount of people in this little area, there are now close to 9.5 million people living in Israel.
Under 10 million population.
Yeah.
And they have such a strong influence in global politics.
And in fact, as the other nations are being affected by economy today, their economy just keeps on growing and bucking the trend. Their shekel just gets stronger and stronger. I listened to a gentleman speak earlier this year in Israel, and he said, if you're an investor and you're not invested in Israel, you're clearly invested in the wrong place, because they actually go against the trend, even when there's recession in other countries very often.
Sure. So. And now, Vivienne, we've seen these prophecies written here by Ezekiel. And then since 1948 until now, the world has witnessed how these prophecies are being fulfilled. But the organization where you work has played a big role also in the fulfillment of some of these prophecies. Tell us a little bit about that. How did your organization has been part of this? God used you guys as God used many other institutions in a very specific area of the fulfillment of these prophecies. Tell us a little bit about that as well.
So most of these prophecies, of course, are talking about the people coming back to the land and being planted in the land. But in 1967, a very significant thing happened. First of all, going back to 1948, we know that Israel was attacked by 5 Arab armies the day after they became a nation, and God protected them against all odds. But they did lose East Jerusalem and part of the biblical heartland. The Jordanians took that over. And then they were attacked again in 1967. And an amazing thing happened. Israel took back East Jerusalem, and the biblical heartland again came back into their hands.
This is 67 war.
In the 67 war. And this really wasn't even expected that it would happen. Even Israel didn't expect this to happen. So God obviously had his time for this to happen. And when Jerusalem came back into Jewish hands, it caused, I believe, in the enemy, just chaos in the enemy ranks. Because they recognized that Jesus' last words, some of his last words were, you will not see me again until you say, Baruch haba Hashem Adonai, blessed are you who come in the name of the Lord, until you call me to come. And he's coming back to Jerusalem. So the enemy realized this is significant.
Can I pause there for a minute? So for Jews to be able to say Baruch haba Hashem Adonai, they need to be in control of Jerusalem at the first place. Yes. Not only that, but also they need to be in control of the temple ground.
Yes.
Because they need to welcome Jesus into the temple ground.
Yes and no. I suppose the temple ground is always significant because that's where God met with his people. It's a place almost where we say heaven and earth meets. But he rose from the Mount of Olives and he said to his people, just like you saw me come, I will come back again to this place. So he's coming back to the Mount of Olives, and from there he will walk towards the Temple Mount. The fact is that today, you're quite correct. Jewish people have to be in Jerusalem to welcome him to come back to that city, because that's where he's coming back to. And the enemy knows that.
So 1967, when Jews took Jerusalem, this was a very significant moment.
A very prophetic, significant moment, because even Luke 21 speaks about the fact that Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles for a period of time until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And so in a sense, that happened in 1967. So we almost entered another prophetic era where I believe he was turning his attention towards his people on another level. And you must remember when Israel became a nation in 1948, there were almost hardly any Jewish believers. In fact, they talk about 12. They literally talk about a few that they knew about.
They talk about it, but we don't know if it was really there.
We don't know for sure. It was very, very few. They were early. But today, and I think particularly since 1967, we have an explosion of Messianic communities and believers. It's still a minority, but we do not know what God is doing under the spotlight with his people. We believe he's meeting with them all the time. But let's come back to your question. In 1967, when this happened, it was significant. And then in 1980, Israel eventually decided, let's pass the Jerusalem law. Let's put the fact that Jerusalem is our capital into the statute books. And when they did that, the Arab nations got very upset. And they were just used by the enemy, of course, of God himself. And they said, no, we outright reject the Jerusalem law. It's our capital. Jerusalem is not the capital of Israel. And they threatened that all 13 embassies that had countries that had embassies in Jerusalem in 1980 must please leave, reject the Jerusalem law, move down to Tel Aviv and open the embassies there. And if they didn't do that, the Arabs literally threatened that they would not supply them with oil. And it was the years of the oil embargo. And
this was 1980s.
80. And all 13 embassies that were present in Jerusalem moved down to Tel Aviv. This was a great insult to the Jewish nation. They loved their Jerusalem. It was their beloved capital since King David made it his capital 3,000 years ago. And they were very hurt by this rejection. And it was at that very time that God led a group of men and women who were praying in Jerusalem to open a Christian embassy in that vacuum and said to them, no, the nations might reject you, but there are Christians around the world that stand with you, that recognize Jerusalem as the eternal, undivided capital of Israel. And we are going to open an embassy at this time in that vacuum and comfort you at this time. And I remember some of the chief rabbis even said this was a golden page in the history of Israel, this Christian embassy that opened. Some of them said, we don't know what a Christian embassy is going to do, but we are so glad you are here.
There's at least one embassy in Jerusalem.
Thank you that you've come. And from that very time, we decided to be a comfort to Israel in a very practical sense. Because Romans 15 verse 27 speaks about the fact that if we as Gentiles understand what we have spiritually received from our Jewish brothers, we will in fact recognize that we are obligated, it actually says, to share with them or to minister to them with our material blessings. So Christians immediately wanted to bless Israel in a financial sense, and the International Christian Embassy used most of that finance in those early years to get involved with Aliyah and to help to finance this great move of God to bring the Jewish people back to the land and plant them in the land. And so from 1980, we've been very involved. And at that time, the Soviet Union was still closed. The Cold War was still on. And we had to make a way to get them through Budapest, through Vienna. We opened up a channel through Finland. We actually had staff that would go into behind the Iron Curtain and fish for the Jews, like the scripture speaks about, and go and meet with them and say to them, they need to come home. They've been persecuted still, they always were persecuted in those countries, and it's time for God to bring them back again to their land. And so we facilitated that already from 1980. Fascinating what went on at that time. And unfortunately, we see some signs of this happening again, because in the 25th of December, 1991, the Iron Curtain opened. Yeah. And so it was wonderful, because now there was freedom for the Russian Jews and the Soviet Jews to come. And do you know that between 1991 and 2000, almost 1 million Jews from Russia and the former Soviet Union came back to Israel? It is a miracle of massive proportions.
Nearly 1 million of them since between 1991 and 2000.
Yes.
This is crazy.
No, it's incredible. And it is, as he says, a massive miracle. I believe it's the biggest miracle since the resurrection of Jesus, literally. And the point that we have to ask is, do the nations recognize this miracle? Do the church of Jesus recognize this miracle that has happened before our eyes? And I find that some of them don't, many of them don't. And yet it's happening, as you say, before our eyes. And we are this generation witnessing this massive miracle. he says that there will come a time that even the Jewish people will recognize that it is only the God of Israel that could have performed this miracle. Maybe what is interesting as well is he says he would plant them back in the land in their unclean state. He says he would bring them back still in an unclean state. And once they're planted in the land, there he will meet his people. There he will sprinkle them with clean water. There he would turn their hearts of stone into hearts of flesh. And what is exciting for me is that Christians, as we have come and ministered to our Jewish family and just loved them, comforted them, and in a very practical way ministered by literally paying for them to come home, building Holocaust survivor homes for them in Israel. Just a few weeks ago, another 9 Ukrainian Holocaust survivors came to the Holocaust survivor home in Haifa that we help fund and support. And as they see the value of things like the bomb shelters, the ICEJ has paid for and erected over 100 bomb shelters. And we see now with the recent Gaza incursion and the rockets that came across how valuable those bomb shelters were. And so they recognize the love of Christians. And this is starting to move their hearts from hearts of stone into hearts of flesh. They're starting to be softened as they recognize, what are these Christians doing who actually serve Jesus, serve Yeshua, who is actually the Messiah that was meant for them first, and who came for them first. And when they come to us and they say to us, why do you love us so much? Why do you care about us? And they know the history of the church has not been good for the previous 2,000 years. Then we can say to them, your Messiah's love in our hearts is giving us a love for you. And we just want to bless you and love you. And this is such a beautiful way that we can help to play a part almost in the work that God is doing in these days.
So actually, God is using you and people like you and this organization to further fulfill Ezekiel 36 and 37 in bringing even more of the Jewish people back to their homeland as Ezekiel prophesied. And we read here in Ezekiel 36 and 37 that God will bring them from all corners of the world.
That's right.
God will make them a one nation under one king as they are now today. Some Christians think that some of the 10 tribes of Jews are still lost out there. But and I know from the scriptures that today in Israel there is one government, and all the descendants of the 12 tribes, God is bringing them bit by bit from all corners of the world, from Ethiopia, from Russia, from Ukraine, as you said. And God is using your organization in this process. So how can people get in touch with you, Vivienne? How can people learn more about these things from you? Or if they want to be practically involved in the great work you guys are doing?
There's a number of ways they can contact us at office@icej.org.za. Vivienne at ICEJ.org.za. Our website is www.icej.org.za. So it's very easy. We have an office here in Stellenbosch. And we are continuously also speaking in small groups and in churches. And I'm welcome. I'm happy to come and speak anytime to even a small group and explain what is the call of Israel, why Israel matters to us as believers. And so also help Christians to be part of this, as you say, miracle of what God is doing in this day. And it is such a blessing to be part of something that touches the heart of our Father so much. And so you are very welcome in any way to contact us. We also have a newsletter that goes out every 2 or 3 months. I also have a WhatsApp group where I keep people updated on an almost daily basis of what's happening in Israel, for those of you that want to know about that. We also have a Facebook page, which you can like and share. We post some interesting information there. And every now and again, we host people from Israel to come and speak, and conferences and events. So there's quite a lot going on and many ways to stay involved. Of course, we're taking a tour. The International Christian Embassy is very well known for the Feast of Tabernacle celebration that they host every year in Jerusalem. And we will be taking a tour again in October to that. So you can even join us on tour if you haven't been to Israel before, and come and experience what is really going on in the land and see the Bible literally before your eyes alive.
Yeah, Vivienne, this is amazing. God is definitely using you, your organization, your people in the fulfillment of Ezekiel 36 and 37. That is for me really amazing. And we see how God has prophesied these things many years ago through prophet Ezekiel, that one day God will bring the Jewish nation back to their homeland.
Yes.
God will give them their original language again.
Yes.
God will give them their original currency again. God will make them a mighty nation again. And it's happening right in front of our eyes. This is an amazing prophecy, busy unfolding, as you rightly say. This is probably the biggest miracle since the resurrection of Jesus. This is a miracle that has been waiting for nearly 2,000 years. Absolutely. Jews have been waiting for this moment for 2,000 years. Some very good Bible prophecy students have been watching for it until 1948, and now it's happening. And God is using you and many others like you. And with that, we greet you in the name of our soon-coming King Jesus Christ. Until I see you again in our next video. From my side, goodbye. And Vivienne, how would you like to greet them?
Been wonderful to chat with you today, and we look forward to maybe hosting you in Jerusalem one day.
God bless you and goodbye.